Okay, hello, welcome back to SUNY History of Jazz, Week 2. It's a video lecture discussion about Jelly Roll Morton's Black Bottom Stomp. Again, I'm quoting John Swed's great foundational text, Jazz 101, Complete Guide to Learning and Loving Jazz in the context of this discussion about Jelly Roll Morton's Black Bottom Stomp, also from the Smithsonian Collection of Classic Jazz. This particular recording, this is on the Week 2 YouTube playlist. Swed writes, "This is a much heralded Morton recording, and rightly so, for it's one of the first masterpieces of jazz composition, and a wonderfully performed piece." Okay, there are two important words put together, jazz composition. Well, three actually. Masterpiece. Okay, we talked in the last video about Maple Leaf Rag, about this idea that, and I appreciate it in Swed and also other jazz historians of the 21st century who are essentially saying whatever we've lionized as the history of jazz in clearly demarcated movements, individuals, times, etc., we need to interrogate that and come up with a more nuanced version of what of the many influences that have created this America's great art form, as I alluded to. Why is it important to say a masterpiece then? Because a masterpiece implies that it is an undisputed work of capstone importance, right? It is somehow singularly identifiable as defining everything else that it is also categorized beside, right? To say Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag is a masterpiece is true. To say that Rollins' Autumn Nocturne is a masterpiece is true. To say Morton's Black Bottom Stomp is a masterpiece is also true, but let us remember that that's sort of journalistic at the same time and kind of unquantifiable. What is not unquantifiable about this assertion is that it is a singularly important work of jazz composition. And that is important because we talk about jazz as springing from improvisation, as the extrapolation of ideas and ornamentation of ideas in real time to create new things on the bandstand in the moment. Well, there are varying degrees of how much is preconceived before those flights of improvisational fancy, so to speak, begin. Jazz compositions are prefigured organizations of sound materials, right? They can be extremely skeletal. They can be extremely dense, particularly densely notated. There's a whole range of possibilities for how to organize something, how to compose it. And then what makes it a jazz composition? Well, what does it include on our list of important signifiers in jazz? Rhythmic impetus, use of, although not, this isn't required of it, it's more like a checklist of things it does have rather than things it needs to have. It does have that rhythmic tension from syncopation, from upbeat and downbeat kind of multiple rhythmic tensions happening at the same time. Right? Remember the kind of downbeats happening, bop, 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 are upbeats. Rhythmic syncopation means the melodic line is emphasizing those upbeats, creating that tension. It also has what we'll start to talk about. You'll hear the term blue notes, or shadings of notes from the blues scale or blues inflection. What does that mean? Well, it means many things, and we'll get into the blues, but for our purposes, for the moment, what I'm referring to then, in addition to that rhythmic tension, are blues elements like flatted third, fifth, and seventh notes in both major and minor scales, which comes from the blues or is signifying of the blues, a genre of African American music of the early 19th century that grew up alongside jazz, and we'll talk about is jazz blues, is blues jazz, etc., as the semester goes on as well. But those are some things that qualify it as jazz composition: blues elements, rhythmic tension, room for improvisation, as well as composition. Perhaps more important than anything else is a jazz composition, almost without fail, I would say. Checking my statement to myself. Almost without fail, I would say that a jazz composition probably will incorporate some kind of improvisation into it. That's a wide net I've just cast, but let's keep that in mind. As to what Morton incorporates in his piece, Swed writes, he incorporates the, quote, Spanish tinge, stomps, breaks, stop time, dynamics of volume, all the elements of jazz as he understood it. Well, there's some more elements of jazz that are in there, right? The Spanish tinge, what is that talking about? Is that music from Spain? Well, yeah, but not literally music from Spain. It's music that would more accurately in English be referred to as the Latin tinge, meaning musics of both Spanish and African origin that coalesced in the New World in Spanish-speaking countries, in Cuba, Spanish-speaking cultures, in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, in Puerto Rico, in Brazil, and the Latin tinge meaning Brazilian Portuguese, right? In Brazil, across South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, particularly the Caribbean, really, in Brazil. Those influences that spread to North America and were included particularly in the music of New Orleans. But ultimately, as we'll see across the semester, the influence of Latin musics, both African Latin musics and European Latin musics, and again, we're parsing out the differences of all these influences because nothing is monolithic, really. The Spanish tinge, as we call it, again, hyperbolically, is referring to something, first of all, it's a misnomer, right? We're not talking about music literally from Spain. We're talking about music that came from Spain and also came from Africa and turned into something else, and then turned into something else again in New Orleans in Morton's hands. So again, the imperfection of categorization. Stomps, referring to a kind of 2 and 4 kind of rhythmic feel, a 2-beat feel. Breaks, whatever that melodic information happens in the middle. Rhythmic breaks where the whole band stops, one voice goes across, stops again on a pregnant place, usually a big old downbeat, or it could be anywhere, keeps going again, etc. Those breaks that create rhythmic tension and sort of formal tension in the music too, some signifier, if not in all jazz, certainly in early jazz. Breaks and stop time. Dynamics of volume, I mean, again, this is not indicative only of jazz composition, but of any good composition, really, or not any good one, but any varied one, right? You're controlling how soft something is, how loud it is, how the music crescendos, how it swells, how it decrescendos, how it comes off of a sort of a larger, louder moment, and all the elements of jazz as he understood it. That's what it says, anyways. All those things are at work in Black Bottom Song. It's from 1926, so we're jumping ahead quite a ways from Maple Leaf Rag, but again, we're sort of talking about the early 20th century now. The late 19th century, the early 20th century. Jelly Roll Morton, by the time this was recorded, had already been playing this music for a decade plus. So it's divided into 2 parts. The first having 3 themes, although all are based on the same chord sequence. That means there's no modulation, doesn't change keys. With all 3 themes written out, meaning not improvised, right? It says the solo trumpet passages that alternate with the whole band in the second theme were written out, though they sound improvised, as does the clarinet solo in the third theme. That speaks to the kind of porousness of these materials. It's not that there weren't preconceived themes in early jazz composition, it's that they would be often extrapolated on. And then we hear that later with Coleman, Hawkins is improvised, but that Rollins' Autumn Nocturne, right? We hear him, and even in Rollins' improvisations, we hear him both. We always hear this in jazz composition. We hear elaborations of melody as a priority rather than exact replication of a written set of instructions. Okay, so even when something sounds written, it might be tampered with. Even when something sounds improvised, it might be written but extrapolated on. There's a porousness between what's on the paper and what comes out of the instrument on the bandstand. It says, after a brief interlude and a change of key, okay, so here we're also talking about these kind of formal things like we said with Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. Similarly, we have this kind of, Morton is a composer, right? In the European sense of the term, musical composition is often referring to the way you set up the sonic architecture, the way you have different sections. This goes that long, this comes in, that comes next, right? This is what we're talking about here. A brief and a very common, again, a European trope in composition is to change key for contrast. You're going along in C major, you get to a transition section, let's try it in C minor now, or let's try it up a minor third, whatever the specific, let's try it up a fifth, whatever the, and start in G, whatever the modulation particularly is, that creates a new harmonic plane. And with that a sense of contrast for our ear. Check this out. It says varied by soloists and the full group 6 more times. I mean, this is very, very sectional composition. Do this, do it again, change the texture, try a new key, do it again, new soloist. It's like those are little discrete. That's not cyclical at all. It's African in its rhythmic impetus, in its use of blue notes and blues gesture, in its Spanish tinge or Latin tinge, in its all these things. But it's also is a European music too. This is the uncomfortable reality of what we're facing, or if not uncomfortable, the sort of the more nuanced than we can possibly imagine reality. This is American music that is so many things have gone into create what we understand to be jazz. This is once again showing that in its earliest nascent forms. The constant shifting of rhythms and rhythmic devices gives each theme and its variation a lively feel, right? This is no dirge. This is a upbeat, a stomp, right? Something with a brisk tempo and rhythmic liveliness. Every chorus seems fresh and inspired with a new combination of instruments appearing each time. He repeats. There are 6 different instrumental combinations used, though there are only 7 instruments in the band. That means the arrangement is quite sophisticated, right? A musical arrangement or an orchestration referring to the instruments that are deployed, when, and how. We'll hear this. We'll talk about this a lot with Duke Ellington soon enough. Jelly Roll Morton, one of jazz's first great composers, right? One of the first great jazz composers. Before it's over, we hear stop time, backbeat. Okay, we already know stop time. Yum dun dun, yum dun dun, ding dun 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 ding 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 ding. Right, those stop places where the whole band stops. That's that. 2 beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. Really emphasizing every 2 beats. 4 beat. 1, 2, ding, 2, 4, 1. 4-beat oriented, right? It was pointing towards a more modern jazz conception. A complete suspension of the rhythm section during the piano solo. Again, arrangement. Jazz composition is constantly deploying whatever instruments it possibly can in different, or isn't, but often does, and often the best does, in different combinations, in different textural and timbral results that come from that. In the first of these, the whole band comes together, but drops the volume to a whisper. There's those dynamics he's referring to. The drama that you get from playing at a whisper, and then playing a huge texture, right? And then coming back, whatever, those various devices. Those are compositional gestures that have their roots in European compositional techniques of the classical romantic eras. It's not that there isn't quiet music that comes from the continent, African continent, of course there is, but this idea of deploying them in certain places. We come down for this, we go up for that, we come back down. Again, think about all that sectional stuff we're talking about. All of this happens within approximately 3 minutes, and yet it seems organic, every note leading to the next, with drive and spirit and inevitability. Those are Swed's excited words. Think about that. All of it happens within 3 minutes. Why? Because that is the amount of time that could fit on the side of a small, little 10-inch record, playing at 78 RPM, right? This is before the advent of the long-playing record. The music that we hear on a recording, our documented evidence of the era, especially in early jazz, until essentially Coleman Hawkins, right? Until the late 30s, into the 40s, until recording technology changed. It is hard for us to know, really, because of the not only the length of songs that could fit on the side of a 10-inch record, but also because of antiquated, not antiquated is the wrong word, sort of proto-recording techniques, right? The loudest instrument goes farthest in the back, the quietest one goes in the front. One microphone records everybody. All these various, if we look into early recording techniques, we see how skeletal it is. And so it's hard to hear the evidence that we're talking about, that we're discussing and trying to figure out what's happening. It's hard to understand exactly what the percussion is doing, or what the bass is doing, or the tuba if you can't hear it, what the banjo is doing if it's not amplified, what the acoustic guitar is doing if it's not amplified. Not usually hard to hear the clarinet or the cornet, right? The instruments that are in the upper registers that are directional and playing right into a mic. But it's hard to get the whole picture. So all these things, the nuances and subtleties of Morton's jazz composition techniques, is a bit hard sometimes to parse if you can't hear exactly what's going on. Still, having said that, there's enough recorded evidence to be able to say categorically, because of all the things that we just talked about, Black Bottom Stomp is a masterpiece of jazz composition because of all the ways it succeeds. It checks all these boxes unself-consciously, and is so many things at once that define what nascent jazz was in the early 20th century. That there you have it. We can't not speak to the performances of the individuals too in the group, and that's important. We'll get to that more. The relationship between the composer and the instrumentalist. Here's this piece of music. Here's a jazz composition for you instrumentalists. I want you to bring your own individual voice to its birth, to its sounding, so that the quality of the composition becomes greater once it is sounded by instrumentalists of the highest caliber or whatever it is. As in, when we are evaluating a masterpiece of jazz composition, it has as much to do with the performances by the individuals in the ensemble as it does by the sort of ivory-towered composer handing down the work from on high. Okay? That's some words about Morton's Black Bottom Stomp. Hope you enjoy. Give it a listen, and talk to you soon.